Is underway for a man accused of shooting and killing a motorcyclist in ARP. 32-year-old Joshua Tibbetts of Waco was arrested back in May 2020 for engaging in organized criminal activity for the shooting death of Brandon Edwards. He's also accused of being a criminal street gang member, but as KLTV7's Christine Guevara reports, Tibbetts pleaded not guilty and said today he is not part of that gang.
The state began their opening arguments by distinguishing the rival motorcycle clubs, the Ugly Man Cossacks Club and the One Percenter Cossacks Gang. The state claims that Joshua Tibbetts is a part of the Ugly Man Club, while Brandon Edwards was a part of the One Percenters Gang. In May of 2020, prosecutors argued Tibbetts and at least one of his co-defendants chased down Edwards and shot him from their truck, all because of his alleged involvement with a Cossacks group they believed is fake.
Both people are shooting a person with the intent to kill. They are both guilty of murder. It doesn't matter who it is.
The defense argued that although Tibbetts did ride in the truck that day,
that does not make him a member of the Ugly Man Cossacks for the purposes of this prosecution, and you have to understand that.
The state called on witnesses who were bystanders of the shooting. They testified to hearing shots and seeing Edwards unconscious. One of the state's witnesses was a forensic pathologist. The doctor showed the jury the autopsy, determining that the wounds are from a gunshot.
Overall, what is the cause of death? So the gunshot wound to the back, and the manner of death is what? Homicide.
The state also called a witness who was a part of the One Percenters Gang in 2020. The witness said he and Edwards were supposed to meet up and head to Waco that day, but Edwards never showed up. And when he learned about the shooting,
I had my suspicions after doing some research that it was an ugly man that did it.
The other two suspects have been sentenced for their crimes. The two, Jeff Griffin and Jose Valenzuela, both pleaded guilty and received 22 years confinement in the death of Edwards. Christine Guevara, KLTV 7 News.
And Tibbetts' trial continues tomorrow morning beginning at 9 in the Smith County Courthouse. Also